One of the most tragic chapters in human history is the transatlantic slave trade, when at least 12 million enslaved Africans were violently and cruelly uprooted from their homes and sent across the Atlantic Ocean to strange lands. It's thought that as many as 2 million died before they even got there. In this episode, we look at how, where, and why this slave trade began and the devastation it wreaked on Africans and their continent.
There was not a single spot of a continent that was out of reach of enslavers. It is more than the physical destruction of people. There was no hope for anyone for centuries.
So the consequences is the development of Africa, just because they chose the youngest and the strongest.
The transatlantic slave trade that existed between the 16th and 19th centuries was as catastrophic as it was extensive. This is Ghana's Atlantic coast, and I've come here to give you a sense of just how many European nations were involved in the slave trade. There are more than 30 old slave trading forts along a 250-kilometre stretch of beach today, built by various European powers. Cape Coast Castle was built by the Swedes in 1653, but it changed hands 5 times over the next 11 years, ending with the British. Now, when the castle was originally built, it wasn't done very well. The roofs would leak, the ceilings were pretty dodgy, and the walls were quite insecure that they could even collapse. And so the whole castle was rebuilt in the mid-1770s. I want to point out something to you. Where those boys are going in is one of the male slave dungeons. And above it is what was a church. Today it's a library. So I just want you to reflect on that. Many meters below, a male slave dungeon, and above ground, a church, which the European slave traders would worship at. Much has been written about the experience of enslaved Africans in Europe and the Americas, but less about what slavery meant for Africa. First, it's important to understand that the Europeans were not the first to trade in enslaved Africans. The Arabs had engaged in this centuries earlier on a massive scale across the continent, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. Also, Africans themselves had long practiced a form of slavery, using captives from battle as unpaid labourers, soldiers, or domestic servants. Cameroonian academic Professor Augustin Hole is president of the Scientific Committee of UNESCO's General History of Africa, on which this series bases its facts. He says Africans were treated very differently in indigenous slavery from how they were put to use in the transatlantic slave trade.
The main difference is that people were captive, were not sold. People were enslaved through war, through debt, but they were able to become included in the families of the captives. They were supposed to be taken care of. It doesn't mean that they have a wonderful life, but they couldn't be sold to somebody else. They were slaves of these families, and they were doing the work for this family. That's really the major difference. So they were deprived of freedom, of course. They would have to work for the masters or for the mistress, but they were not a commodity.
But Professor Perry says indigenous slavery helped enable the transatlantic trade.
In fact, when we talk about what became like the slave trade, it was something that was benefited from the internal African slavery itself, the system as it existed, because those are people that became the basic targets of people to be sold as slaves, because it was difficult to sell people from your own village as slaves. So it was these people that had been conquered because they were weak, and then you easily sell them.
Ghanaian professors Akosua Perby and Essie Sutherland Addy are two of the most prominent academics in Africa on slavery.
There's always been an indigenous internal aspect of slavery, and then there's been an external aspect of slavery. And the indigenous aspect had to do with the need for labor, mainly for the farms, for the mines, for the fisher folk, and so on. And then also what made the indigenous slavery a bit peculiar was that people also needed slaves as wives. The slave markets, women always fetch a higher price than men. When they marry the women, have children with them, and the children became part of the family. And what I found in my research was that in the indigenous system, women always price higher than the men. But in the Atlantic system, the men priced higher than the women. Women, mainly in Africa, we needed for marriage and to help with household chores. The men were needed to go and do their back-breaking labors across the Atlantic.
And also, I suppose, the internal slave system, they were not accorded an inferior status simply because of the race that they belonged to.
No, it wasn't a question of race. It was a question of who had power over who, prisoners of war, people who were exchanged for ritual purposes, various reasons. The coming in of the transatlantic slave trade definitely exacerbated a quest to buy and sell people. And there's no question about that.
To find out about the origins of the transatlantic slave trade, I make my way to Senegal, where the biggest ethnic group are the Wolof. I'm invited to join local women from St. Louis for a traditional meal, cebuche, made up of rice, fish, and vegetables.
Oui, non, je mange. Vous n'aimez pas les cebuche? Non, c'est très, très bon.
The ancestors of these women could have been amongst those who received the first Europeans to arrive in this part of West Africa, Portuguese sailors in 1444. The Portuguese first disembarked on West Africa's Atlantic coast on a small island which they called Ile de Palma. It later became known as Ile de Gore. For the first few years, the Portuguese were trying to find routes from Africa to India for the spice trade. However, to see exactly where the Portuguese began to use Africans for forced labour, we must go from Senegal to Cabo Verde. About 500 kilometers off the coast of Senegal is Cabo Verde, sometimes called Cape Verde. This is made up of 10 islands, all but one inhabited, and this is Praia, the capital, on the biggest island, Santiago. Cabo Verde is Africa's most western point. It lies on the Atlantic Ocean crossroads linking Africa, Europe, and the Americas. This gave it a strategic position, a significance not lost on the Portuguese. In 1462, around 100 Portuguese and Spanish settlers arrived on this island. It was then uninhabited. They called it Santiago and made it their capital. One of the first Portuguese to come here was Diogo Gomes, and there's a statue of him here. The Portuguese traders built settlements in Cabo Verde, like here in the old town of Santiago, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Just off the main square is Rua de Banana, a narrow cobbled road with single-storey thatched cottages dating back to the 16th century. That makes this probably the oldest road in the oldest town established by Europeans in West Africa. Antonio Monteiro and his partner, Nina Ferreira, have lived here most of their lives, and Antonio says his family have owned this house for generations. Hello, nice to see you. Oi, oi, oi. So this is your home?
Casa que herdei da minha dona, da minha mãe e minha mãe, que herdei. Minha mãe mora, já nem que fica com ela.
The Portuguese grew food crops for themselves and reared domestic animals, but they also wanted to make money. So they decided to plant crops like sugarcane and cotton for export. And for that, they needed an unpaid labour force. So thousands of Africans were brought in from some of the main communities of West Africa, like the Wolof. Professor Antonio Correa is one of Cabo Verde's foremost historians on the transatlantic slave trade.
Os portugueses vieram atrás de mão de obra, de mão de obra. Viram que a mão de obra africana era importante, não apenas como comércio, mas como conhecimento. O know-how africano foi muito importante para criar aqui as primeiras plantações, não de sugar, não de açúcar, mas de algodão. E essa tecnologia era africana e não europeia. A tecnologia de tecelagem e de fiação que se faz aqui é sobretudo africana. Isto é extremamente importante. E esses escravos que chegam a Cabo Verde, eles fornecem uma base de conhecimento, não só força bruta muscular, e os europeus vão aprender a viver nos trópicos, a produzir a agricultura tropical com os africanos, e não o inverso.
Dias from the National Heritage Institute in Praia, the capital of Cabo Verde, says the cotton grown by the slaves was woven into fine cloth by enslaved weavers, and this was highly valued and indeed became a chief currency of trading.
Mais uma mistura do que veio da Europa e do que o escravo fazia aqui em Cabo Verde, é uma invenção de Cabo Verde. Normalmente temos aqui o algodão, que é o algodão, que é depois da colhida é feito um tratamento, para separar da semente, e depois temos o algodão aqui trabalhado. Depois temos aqui a urzela, que é uma planta tintureira, uma planta que é utilizada para produzir a tinta, que no final que é para produzir para fazer a tinta, que é essa aqui é igual a um pão, dizemos, o nome é pão. 60 anos mais ou menos. Normalmente são feitos por tiras de mais ou menos 15 centímetros. São essas tiras que normalmente depois são cozidas uma na outra para produzir o maior.
However, the supply of cotton and foodstuffs from Cabo Verde was not profitable enough for the Portuguese settlers, so they turned to two other activities. They used Cabo Verde's strategic position to repair and resupply ships, and crucially also to trade in slaves to sell to the Caribbean, the Americas, and Europe. They based themselves at forts like this one, Real de São Felipe, built in the 16th century in the old town of Santiago.
The Portuguese were supplying a market. In fact, there was a high demand of enslaved workers in the Caribbean. The Caribbean was a superpower at that time because the sugar industry was requiring lots of labor, and the native population was exterminated by forced labors and enslavement. So they provided these workers to the Spaniards first, and to the settler in Brazil also.
The market at Cabo Verde was easy to access from all directions from the Atlantic. This marble column in the main square of the old town of Santiago is where enslaved Africans were brought from the mainland of West Africa to be sold by Portuguese traders. Slaves who were considered to be disobedient might have been tortured here or even executed.
Devo dizer, inclusive, que Cabo Verde é o primeiro entreposto oceânico de tráfico de escravos. Os homens aqui da cidade eram armadores de navios, eram proprietários de terras e de escravos. Então, eles dominavam a Câmara Municipal, o poder local. E o Pelourinho é o símbolo do poder local. E era também um lugar onde se fazia justiça pública. E muitas vezes se punia os escravos no Pelourinho. Então, em Cabo Verde, era uma verdadeira Babel africana. Os africanos que vieram para aqui, vieram como escravos, mas mantiveram durante algum tempo suas línguas, suas culturas. A capacidade dos europeus neutralizar isso não era grande. Então, essa experiência de interação entre europeus deslocados e africanos deslocados é o início de um novo mundo, do mundo atlântico, de forte base africana, de predomínio africano, mas de domínio europeu. É um momento de inovação, do ponto de vista histórico, a história do mundo.
The Portuguese began exporting enslaved Africans from Cabo Verde from around 1510. A short time later, on the Atlantic coast of mainland Africa, they also established a big slave trade center on the Ile de Gorée. It's impossible to know exactly how many enslaved Africans passed through here, but the island was basically a warehouse consisting of more than a dozen slave houses. I visit one of the best known of these, the House of Slaves. Amongst its most striking features is the door of no return, the point of departure across the ocean. The House of Slaves attracts hundreds of visitors every day from Senegal, other parts of Africa, and from all over the world. The spacious, airy living quarters of the masters is in strong contrast to the dark dungeons in which hundreds of slaves were kept before they were sent into a life of enslavement. When you go inside one of the cells at the House of Slaves, it's so difficult to imagine that at any one time there were dozens of men, women, or children held in these dark, concrete dungeons. It was a systematic, organized, yet the most barbaric of all trades. The director of the House of Slaves, Eloy Colley, has worked here for 3 decades.
So when someone come to the House of Slaves, I never didn't see the skin color. It's just a question of heart, finally, to consider that what's happened between the 16th until 19th was not a normal thing.
You feel so energies here, but sad energies, and you feel a pain inside you. It's there are no words for that.
The possibility that your distant relatives may have had to go from here, kind of feeling like there's some sort of connection between here and kind of where we are now, especially coming from America.
In his time at the House of Slaves, Eloy Colley has given this talk countless times.
The rate was for one slave taken for ships to America. 6 or 7 Africans died in Africa as victims of the slave trade for 4 centuries.
What are the long-term consequences of that?
The consequences is the development of Africa, just because they chose the youngest and the strongest
from Africa to Americas.
And do you believe that this has contributed to the underdevelopment of Africa?
Absolutely. Because the population of Africa, they dissuade completely, so the African family structure. It's the first step. And the second step is in population, in terms of population in Africa. And also in terms of workers, because they need the strongest and the youngest.
Eloy Colley shows me how the enslaved Africans were divided into different categories. That category there says young women and jeune filles. And then over there...
temporarily unfit, because the value of a man was depending on his weight, on his muscle. So that's why the minimum weight for a man was 60 kg, 120 pounds.
I also noticed the very small holding cells for the recalcitrant slaves who were obviously rebelling against their captivity.
Yes, absolutely. You can see how they load the slave on board. So it will explain that they don't take into consideration that they are a human being.
So they would have shackles
on
their arms,
yes,
their feet bound together.
Yes. They use one chain for two slaves. One leg of the first slave, and the rest of the chain was in the second slave. And between the two legs of the slaves was attached a very big iron bowl, which was about 10 kilograms, 300 grams.
Eloy Colley says the door of no return helps conjure the past horrors of what it meant to leave your home and family, never to go back.
After the door was a kind of wooden bridge, but what is important to take into consideration, having this kind of a door is very useful in terms of history. What is important is exactly what's happened during that period.
You've spent 30 years based here, surrounded by tragic circumstances that you confront every day. Don't you go home depressed every evening when you leave your office?
No. Because the necessity was to know exactly what's happened during that period. Again, the thing is to try to go back to the period and to learn more what's happened during that period. It's the only way to better grasp or to understand what's happened. If you understand what's happened exactly, so it's possible so to communicate. The only reparation we need is first to consider that what's happened is a part of the history of human being. Secondly, to teach this part of the history. And also to preserve the memories of the victims. It's the only thing that we need today.
As I say my goodbyes to Eloy Colley, I'm left wondering all the same how difficult it is to be custodian of an institution with a history as tragic as the House of Slaves. After the break, how the slave trade spread and why some Africans themselves were complicit in the acquisition and sale of their fellow Africans. The transatlantic slave trade extended right across the West African coast. A fertile stretch of this along Nigeria today was in fact known as the Slave Coast. It was then one of the most densely populated parts of Africa and one of the most important centers with the Atlantic slave trade from the early 16th to the 19th century. The slave trade was part of a wider network known as the triangular trade.
It is a triangle between the name of a ship leave from Europe, go take the cargo of enslaved people in Africa and ship them to Caribbean or South America or exceptionally North America, and take sugar and different products from the Caribbean. So it was already sugar, but was a hot product at the time, and later it was cotton and shipped it to Europe for manufacturing purposes and transformation. So this is what I call a triangular trade.
So the ships were never empty of cargo,
Yes.
human and non-human.
Exactly. Whiskey, weapons, beads for Africa, humans for the Americas and Caribbeans, sugar and different products from the Caribbean to Europe.
The transport of slaves to the Americas and Caribbean was known as the Middle Passage. Slaving ships made calls along Africa's Atlantic coast, including here in Lagos, Nigeria's main port. Africans were also acquired from the interior of the continent, for instance from the Kingdom of Congo, which includes territory today that makes up the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Angola. The colony of Luanda was established by the Portuguese in 1575. They were mostly interested in the slave trade. They conquered the coastal areas which could serve as slave trading hubs, and Luanda was the biggest of these. They built this fort, San Miguel, where statues of former Portuguese dignitaries still tower over visitors attending a cultural festival here. A large number of enslaved Africans were sent by the Portuguese, mostly to Brazil, then the Caribbean,